They said the basement wall had been repainted every decade, but the stain never disappeared. In 1919, when the archivist at St. Mark's Seminary scraped the final layer of whitewash from the stone, he found something older beneath it, an imprint shaped like a man pressed into the wall. Not carved, not drawn, pressed, as if flesh had been forced into stone and left there to rot into memory. The record of that discovery vanished within 48 hours. Tonight, we begin where history refused to look. This is not the story you were taught about slavery. This is not about plantations, chains, or auction blocks. This is about design, about a system engineered so quietly, so precisely, that it convinced generations it had always existed. And at the center of that design is a name most textbooks bury in a footnote, if they mention it at all. John Punch, a man who ran, a man who was punished, a man whose sentence became a blueprint. Between 1800 and 1950, America built churches, orphanages, seminaries, and towns that inherited his shadow. Places where laws were not enforced with whips, but with silence. Where children learned obedience before language. Where entire bloodlines were trained to accept punishment as destiny. This documentary is a descent into those places. We will follow the paper trail that shouldn't exist, the sermons written but never preached, the family records that end mid-sentence, and the doctrine that transformed human suffering into administrative routine. Because John Punch did not die in the 17th century, he was replicated, and what was done to him became something far worse than slavery. It became policy. The official record is brief. Too brief. John Punch, an African indentured servant, attempted escape in Colonial, Virginia. His white companions were punished with extended servitude. Punch was punished with something else. Lifetime servitude. Not years. Not conditions. Not redemption. Forever. That moment, quietly recorded in court ink, was the first time American law divided punishment by race. But what history fails to confront is why this sentence was different. Legal historians describe it as precedent. Clergy described it as divine order. Administrators described it as efficient. But private correspondence from the 1800s tells a different story. Letters between seminary trustees refer to the Punch Resolution not as a law, but as a principle, a concept that could be applied beyond labor, beyond bodies, to identity itself. By the early 19th century, this principle had migrated into institutions. Orphanages that classified children by permanence. Churches that preached obedience as inherited condition. Town councils that quietly maintained registries of families whose surnames were marked, not officially, but internally. These families didn't know why doors closed to them, why debts followed them for generations, why punishment always seemed heavier. They were told it was moral failure. They were told it was God's will. But it was neither. It was an echo of a sentence designed to never end. John Punch wasn't enslaved because he was African. He was African so that enslavement could be justified. And once that logic was accepted, once it was normalized, it no longer required chains. Only paperwork. Between 1820 and 1880, dozens of rural seminaries appeared across the American South and Midwest. On paper, they were religious institutions. In practice, they functioned as something else entirely. Moral correction centers. Their sermons were never recorded. Their disciplinary logs were sealed, and their graveyards unmarked. Former students, those who survived, spoke decades later of lessons that had nothing to do with Scripture. Children were taught to memorize passages about obedience, inheritance, and suffering. Punishment was framed not as cruelty, but as alignment. You are correcting what was decided before you were born. That sentence appears in 3 separate journals from 3 separate states. Inside these institutions, lineage mattered more than behavior. Some students could be redeemed. Others were labeled fixed, permanent, irreversible. No explanation was given. The churches claimed divine authority. The law never interfered, because the doctrine aligned perfectly with the old sentence. Lifetime servitude had become lifetime correction, and correction, once moralized, could be infinite. What these churches preserved was not faith, but a theology of control, a belief that some people existed to carry punishment forward, so others could remain pure. John Punch's sentence had become sacrament. In 1907, an orphanage in Indiana burned to the ground. Official reports say all records were destroyed, but one ledger survived, hidden inside a false wall. Inside were names, birth dates, and a final column labeled only with a symbol resembling a closed eye. Every child marked with that symbol disappeared before adulthood. No adoption records. No burial certificates. No prison files. Nothing. What investigators later realized, too late, was that these children shared surnames traced back to families listed in earlier seminary registries. The same families. The same invisible mark. They were not being raised. They were being contained. Taught silence. Taught submission. Taught that resistance was inherited sin. This was not slavery as history remembers it. This was administrative damnation. And it was legal. Because once John Punch was sentenced forever, the idea of forever entered American law. And forever does not need chains. It only needs belief. In 1838, a county clerk in Ohio wrote a letter he never mailed. It was found folded inside a family Bible nearly 70 years later, the paper stained with fingerprints pressed so deeply they tore the fibers. In the letter, he described a ledger that did not exist on any official inventory. It contained no names written in ink, only indentations, as if names had once been there and were carefully erased. "You can still feel them," he wrote. "Run your finger across the page, and you will know who was never meant to leave." The clerk claimed these registries were circulated privately between courts, churches, and orphanages. They tracked families not by crime, but by classification. Words like permanent, fixed, and non-transient appeared again and again. No explanation followed. What terrified him most was not the list, but the fact that every institution already knew who was on it. No announcement was made. No accusation spoken. Life simply narrowed. Loans denied. Apprenticeships revoked. Children redirected into care facilities. It was a system that required no enforcement because it had been accepted as natural order. Historians later dismissed the letter as paranoia, but they never explained why the registries disappeared the same year federal census reforms began asking about free and unfree populations in new ways. The categories had changed. The control had not. John Punch's sentence had evolved from lifelong servitude to lifelong designation. And designation does not need chains. It only needs coordination. Drive through certain American towns today, and you will feel it. Empty main streets. Churches with locked doors but fresh paint. Schools that closed without ceremony. Locals will tell you the town just faded. But records show something else. In towns founded between 1840 and 1870, population growth followed a pattern, until it didn't. Entire family lines vanished from records without migration, death, or marriage documentation. They didn't leave. They were absorbed. Children from marked families were quietly relocated into institutions for training. Adults were reassigned labor indefinitely through municipal contracts. Not enslaved, assigned. The town prospered briefly, then stagnated. Because once a population is defined as permanent labor, innovation becomes unnecessary. Growth becomes dangerous. These towns weren't meant to thrive. They were meant to contain. John Punch's punishment had taught America something invaluable. If you remove the possibility of an end, resistance collapses on its own. Hope requires an exit. These towns were designed without one. Section 7. The sermon that was never recorded. In 1891, a traveling preacher delivered a sermon in Mississippi that was never written down, but fragments survived in 3 separate diaries. The message was simple. Some souls are born under correction, he said. Not for what they have done, but for what was decided. He warned against compassion, against interference, against questioning why some families never advanced. To disrupt the order is to inherit the punishment. The congregation did not object. They had already accepted it, because for generations, this doctrine had been woven into American morality. Hard work explains success. Failure explains itself. And suffering, persistent, inherited suffering, must be deserved. John Punch had become invisible, but his sentence had become truth. In 1924, sociologist Edwin Mercer attempted to document what he called permanent underclasses. His research focused on families who never accumulated property, never relocated, never broke patterns of punishment. His notes were meticulous, too meticulous. Within 6 months, his funding was revoked. His university disavowed the project. His papers were seized for review. Mercer died 3 years later in obscurity. But one draft survived. In it, he wrote, "This is not neglect. This is not coincidence. This is not failure. This is a sentence repeating itself. He never named John Punch. But he didn't need to. The system already knew who it was protecting. Every system believes it is invisible. That was its first mistake. In 1931, during a courthouse renovation in Maryland, a contractor broke through a sealed crawl space beneath the records room. Inside were wooden crates stamped not with dates, but with symbols, circles closed upon themselves. Inside the crates were baptismal records, not certificates, annotations. Each page listed a child's name, place of birth, and next to it a phrase written in a careful, identical hand. Correction continues. Some entries stretched back 6 generations. The church claimed ignorance. The county denied jurisdiction. The crates vanished before an inventory could be completed. But one photograph survived. It showed a page where the name Punch appeared, not as a person, but as a classification. That was the first undeniable proof that the sentence had become something transferable. Not law, not punishment. Condition. Silence only works until patterns become visible. In the 1920s and 30s, Black families across multiple states began sharing stories, quietly, cautiously. Not about violence, but about stagnation. The same obstacles, the same denials, the same unexplained interventions when children showed promise. A scholarship revoked without reason. A job offer rescinded after a background check that revealed nothing. A child redirected into corrective education. These families did not yet know John Punch's name, but they recognized the shape of his shadow. Something had been inherited that could not be outworked. And once they realized that, fear replaced confusion. Because inheritance cannot be argued with. The fire began in the chapel. Official reports called it electrical. Witnesses said otherwise. Flames spread in a pattern. Altar first, then archive room, then dormitories. As if the building itself knew what needed to be erased. What burned that night was not scripture. It was records, disciplinary histories, lineage maps, lists of students labeled non-transient. Students were relocated. Staff dispersed. The seminary was never rebuilt. But fragments survived. Charred pages found miles away, carried by wind. On one page, barely legible, was a sentence. The Punch doctrine must remain implicit. Once named, it loses its power. Someone had known, and someone had tried to stop it. By the early 1940s, researchers, clergy, and activists began approaching the same conclusion from different directions. That slavery had not ended. It had changed form. That John Punch was not important because of who he was, but because of what was done with him. The moment his sentence was written, America learned how to make punishment eternal without appearing cruel. Name it, and it becomes monstrous. Leave it unnamed, and it becomes normal. Those who tried to name it paid a price. Careers ended. Grants vanished. Reputations collapsed. Not through violence. Through erasure. The same technique used on families. On towns. On memory itself. John Punch had been forgotten deliberately, because forgetting was part of the design. In 1945, America celebrated victory. Factories slowed. Soldiers came home. Flags returned to porches. But in county offices, church basements, and institutional archives, nothing changed. The same registries were quietly updated. The same families were tracked. The same children were redirected. Because the system born from John Punch's sentence was not political. It was administrative. Wars end. Policies remain. Post-war prosperity depended on upward mobility, but only for those not already designated. For others, prosperity was something to support from below, without ever touching. The contradiction was never acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require asking why some Americans were never meant to move forward. By mid-century, the system no longer needed enforcement. It had achieved something far more efficient: internalization. Children raised under correction learned to expect limitation. Parents stopped encouraging dreams that would be punished. Communities adapted to survival rather than advancement. This was not brokenness. It was conditioning. John Punch's sentence had evolved again, from external control to internal restraint. And the most horrifying part? It worked. No guards. No overseers. No chains. Just expectation. And expectation shapes behavior more reliably than force ever could. In 1949, a junior archivist in Virginia discovered a cache of microfilm mislabeled agricultural surveys. It wasn't agriculture. It was lineage mapping, cross-reference families, institutional placements, corrections that never ended. The archivist attempted to publish. The paper was rejected without review. The film was confiscated, but a list of surnames was memorized. Decades later, researchers would independently identify those same surnames as appearing disproportionately in incarceration, poverty, and restricted labor roles. Patterns don't lie. They persist. By 1950, the story America told itself had fully solidified. Slavery was over. Equality was inevitable. Those who struggled simply had not tried hard enough. The system no longer needed secrecy, because it had been replaced by belief. John Punch's sentence no longer needed to be remembered, only felt. And as long as suffering could be blamed on the individual, the design remained untouched. That is how the sentence survived. Not through cruelty, but through explanation. There is a misconception that injustice must announce itself loudly, that it must arrive with violence, spectacle, or chaos. But the most enduring systems move quietly, like paperwork sliding across a desk, like expectations passed from parent to child, like limits so familiar they no longer feel imposed. John Punch's sentence did not end because it was never designed to. It was not punishment in the traditional sense. It was conversion, a moment where a human being was transformed, by law, into a category that could be inherited. Once that happened, the system no longer needed John Punch himself. It needed repetition. And repetition is how history becomes invisible. History remembers revolutions. It forgets procedures. John Punch was dangerous not because of what he did, but because of what was done through him. His case proved that permanence could be assigned, that inequality could be rationalized, and that moral language could disguise structural cruelty. Remembering him threatens the foundation of the story America tells itself. Because if the sentence was intentional, if it was engineered, then its outcomes are not accidental. And that realization is far more disturbing than the idea of past wrongdoing. It suggests continuity. Look around, at patterns that repeat regardless of effort, at disparities explained away as coincidence, at families who carry struggle like an heirloom. This is not to say nothing has changed. It has. But systems rarely disappear. They adapt. They shed names. They lose paperwork. They replace enforcement with belief. The sentence becomes psychological. The correction becomes expectation. And expectation becomes reality. John Punch does not need to be remembered for the system to survive. He only needs to remain unnamed. This documentary does not end with resolution, because the story has not ended. Somewhere, records still exist, misfiled, mislabeled, ignored. Some families still feel the weight without knowing its source. Some institutions still benefit from a design they did not create, but never questioned. John Punch was a man, but what was done to him became something else entirely. A template. And templates are meant to be reused. The question is no longer whether this happened. The question is whether remembering it changes anything. Because systems built on forgetting depend on silence to survive. And once silence breaks, they begin to crack.